And good morning to everyone, and thank you for your presentations. I suppose over the years when we talked about accessibility, we always thought about the physical environment more so, but it's much, much more than that. And I think, as you referred to, Adam in particular, that there's a need for a creation of awareness across all public bodies and employers and services. So I suppose to address a couple of the issues, we talk about, you mentioned universal design and making sure that it is wheelchair livable. And Part M of the building regulations has been mentioned by a couple of you, and you've asked for those to be revised. Is that happening, do you know? Are they going to be revised to ensure that all buildings are wheelchair livable? And also, I suppose, have we any idea of the cost, because that's often what's thrown up about the cost of making something universal design plus, as opposed to having to go back and adapt the house or the building in in later years, if we had a breakdown on that. I suppose, Adam, you say that we don't really know the number of people who are autistic and it's not included on the census. Do you think it should be? And also to both yourself and Diane and I, are you consulted with, or are your members consulted with on a regular basis by planners and by public bodies around accessibility issues? And to the NDA, do you employ many people who have disabilities, or do you consult with people, or what can you tell us the extent you consult with people who have disabilities? Because I know I've talked to people who have been consulted with on issues, right, because the body has to tick a box in order, to ensure that they are fulfilling their obligations, but they just ignore the advice that they're given. So I'm thinking of someone in particular who was consulted with on transport issues. I think it was around cycle lanes, or maybe it was outdoor living or outdoor dining when that was brought in during COVID, and then all their suggestions were just ignored. So, it's to ensure that the consultation is done properly for the right reasons and not just as a box ticking exercise. And if you could talk about that. And I just suppose to ask the NDA, you have a huge you have to oversee the directives that are being introduced. Are you properly resourced, do you feel? Or are you being asked to climb a mountain with very little resources, basically? So thank you. I'm just conscious of time, so thank you.
Thank you, Deputy. I think that the census question is absolutely critical. The reality is, I think we saw just last summer the problems we have when it comes to data and autism in the context of education, for example. So at the minute we have different data sets and there's efforts to marry them, but it's not a perfect science. For just one very simple example of that is, if you're an autistic adult accessing a diagnosis privately, as we know you have to, you won't be in a HSE data set, you won't be in a Department of Education data set. So for me, the census is the way to do it. To be clear, it could be an autism specific question, or it could be a reform of the disability question in the census. At the moment, none of the fields within that question truly speak to an autistic person's experience, and as a result I would fear that people are going unseen and it's affecting national planning. In terms of consultation, I think it's a very mixed picture, to be honest, because I think there certainly is tokenistic consultation on lots of matters across the public sector, and times where consultations aren't even in and of themselves accessible, which kind of, I suppose, undermines the point. What I would say is, if we step away maybe from the policy area and think more about, well, how are we making our service accessible? What we have seen a lot of is public bodies come to us and begin to want support and training in this area. And a key example of that, for example, in recent years would have been libraries, would have been public transport, and would have been universities. An area of priority, I think, is schools, because I know the state is going to be investing heavily over the next decade in new school buildings. And in my view, the school buildings that are being built are less accessible for autistic people in many instances. They're using, very often, just one example, to get to a quiet space, you have to go through very, very busy areas. They're using sometimes very, very vibrant colours that are overwhelming. And even we sometimes see that in the design of autism classes themselves. So I think that's an area that more work does need to be done in.
I'll take the first part, Chair, in a sense. It would be good to see what Adam is looking at there in terms of the expansion of the question on disability in the census. I think it would be better that it be included within that general disability framework than something outside of it, because we must know and see how the growing population of people who nominate as disabled people will impact on the perception of our service deliveries going forward, as well as the population of them. As for tokenistic consultation, I think most of the time, and it will be experienced as organisations grow older in the contact details, I think relationships are built with people like yourself and Pauline, who know that we're there to have a voice, but that voice sometimes isn't called on often enough. I think there is less of the tokenistic side of it than there used to be. I think we're not there just because we should be there as a ticking box exercise. Now, it will happen, and I think, you know, Catherine probably can say in some ways she can experience it, but I'm looking at it over decades, and I've looked at where a lot of the origin of things happen. And sometimes it's in the newness of things that things don't happen correctly, as in the case of the enthusiasm to bring cycling as a form of recreation and as a form of active mobility, and the extent to which it is threatening the safety of elderly and vision impaired people, particularly when you find that the planners, in spite of what you say to them so often about bus islands and floating bus stops, where you have from the footpath to physically cross a cycle lane to actually board or to get off the bus and cross the cycle lane and depend that the cyclist will stop. Somebody said you can run a light up to show the cyclist should stop, but it's all about the cyclist not stopping, and I think that's going to be a danger. And it has happened in other countries that, and probably will happen here, that it will become a human rights difficulty that will probably have to be processed through the Human Rights Commission here to show that the people are being exposed to a danger. I think in terms of the actual physical built environment, Chair, from our side, probably James Cawley is our policy officer in terms of how we are consulted about the physical environment, probably could enlighten you.
Thank you, Chair. I'll answer a number of your questions, Deputy Tully, and then I'll hand to my colleague Ger Craddock to talk about built environment matters. But you asked, does the NDA employ people with disabilities? Yes, you do. Yes, we do. Apologies. In 2020, for example, approximately 20% of our staff felt comfortable declaring that they have a disability, and that is something that we are always keen to focus on. Are we resourced to do our job? I think what we have very successfully done, and particularly Ger's team in the centre, has built awareness of universal design over the last number of years and begun monitoring work on compliance with, as you say, the various directives. What is challenging is the capacity to support the variety of public bodies we interact with on implementation. So we are not finding anyone who argues with universal design as a good idea, but developing the guidance and the toolkits that they need to take it up. That is a resource-intensive work, and I suppose that's where perhaps a little bit extra resourcing would be very welcome. We do work hard on consulting with people with disabilities and their representative organisations in our work, and we take a varied approach to that. Sometimes for specific projects we might have an advisory group that would have membership from DPOs on it. Sometimes we go out wide with public consultation on specific projects. So we take a varied approach, but I think it's something we are working hard on improving over time, and our Participation Matters guidelines, just launched last week, I think will offer a blueprint for ourselves and for all public actors to improve in that space. And I might just make a final point on data that has been spoken about. One of the challenges is getting accurate data from the census, not just about autism, but also it came up in another committee hearing, not knowing accurate numbers of wheelchair users in Ireland. What the NDA would love to see is what's a national disability survey, which is a survey that would be carried out after the next census. So anyone declaring they have a disability on the next census could be followed up with and asked a range of more detailed questions where we could capture specific conditions and specific barriers and challenges. That is something that was done back in 2006, but there hasn't been an opportunity to update that survey since then. It's something we have had preliminary discussions with the CSO on, but we'd very much welcome if there was cross-government support for an NDS, a National Disability Survey, after the next census. But Ger, do you want to handle the built environment matters?
Thanks, Aidan, and thanks thanks, TD, for your questions. Regarding Part M, what we're involved in at the present moment in time is creating guidance to match the work being done by the department on changing places toilets. So Part M is being revised to include changing places toilets. However, on the housing issue, we have been advocating and advising the government, and particularly the Department of Housing, that Part M needs to be revised specifically regarding domestic homes. At the present moment in time, Part M talks about visitability, an unusual word in itself, where we talk about livability, so that the homes need to be livable in. So visitability at the present moment in time talks about level access and an accessible toilet downstairs and access to one other room. That's what's within Part M, which is a bit short on what we are looking for. So I know ILM are very exercised on talking to the Department of Housing on getting Part M being revised. So the other work, as you mentioned, about the cost of universal design, and then back to Adam's point, and then if you design at the very start, universal design is invisible. As in, we go to the supermarket every weekend or wherever, we walk through sliding doors, we never even think about it, as in it's level access. There's car spaces right at the entrance to the shopping mall. There's accessible toilets within the shopping mall. So it's negligible, hard to get around that word, costs if designed at the start. However, we are working on two projects at the moment, one on a cost-benefit analysis of universal design for homes and also a cost assessment. So actually breaking down the individual elements, which we have calculated to be 659 different elements in the home that need to be designed or incorporated. Out of that, over 600 are no cost. So we're down to in the region of about 49-50 elements that there is a cost element. So we're working through that at the moment. We're working with the SCSI and also engaging with the department. But also then looking at the other project, which is a cost-benefit analysis, which is kind of looking at the other long-term benefits of designing well from the start. So looking at cutting down on cost of care, looking at reducing the cost of medical supervision, but also falls, as we all know, particularly with the ageing population. The huge issue is people falling in their own homes. The reason being, as in they are designed poorly. So if we can get the design right at the start, it's a huge savings, and it has been shown internationally, as in we would be in regular contact with the likes of the Norwegians, who would be leaders in Europe. The Japanese have been doing this for 40 years, designing mainly because they've been seen as kind of the most aged population in the world. So they've been designing this in for over 40 years. We're making headway, but we have, as I think everybody has said, we have some way yet to go. I think they were.
Thank you, Catherlock. Yeah, just briefly, I suppose, and just to say I am coming in online from lovely Longford, so thanks for having me here online as well. Just in response to some of those questions that Deputy Tully raised, I think they're really valid questions. I suppose ILMI has consulted its membership around accessibility in a number of areas around the UNCRPD, but also COVID measures that were introduced into cities, but also we have a planning group and we've developed a principle of inclusive a document that covers principles of inclusive planning. But I suppose before we look at even the Part M and the actual logistics of that, I think we need to look at planning issues. Like we talk about consultation there. In some cases, we see where decisions are often reached without any meaningful consultation with disabled people. So the answer to that question there is that consultation should be done directly through disabled persons organisations at all levels, with local, regional, national, etc. And that's the answer, the simple answer to a very complex, I suppose, issue. Of course, we know the built environment is not accessible, but quite often disabled people find out too late about plans. And rather than inputting into the design at concept stage, disabled activists are reacting to planning decisions, and that's an issue as well. In Ireland, we seem to plan and design and build to minimum standards, and often regulation creates barriers to more universal design ways of thinking. I suppose we would be saying, our members have highlighted that part of the building regulations are weak and they do need to be reviewed. Again, look at minimum standards, not maximum standards, and they are simply not working for disabled people. I would recommend that local authorities need to fully monitor the implementation of Part M when it is reviewed, and we do call strongly on that to be reviewed. Of course, the other key element is that we, again, what the NDA have just said there, homes need to be wheelchair livable. We are in a housing crisis. It's very difficult for disabled people to find houses that are accessible for us to actually live in. It's one thing giving us the four walls, but we need to be able to genuinely be included in our communities. And I think accessibility plays a massive part in that in our lives, which allows, again, accessibility does impact on our spontaneity as disabled people as well. And I think that's really important. And when we design and keep accessibility in mind at the design stage, we're actually designing for diversity, which actually now reflects the society that we live in and our intersectionality as well. So I'm just going to leave it there, and I look forward to coming back in further questions. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So I know